This is Ranjit Sawant. I'm product manager in VMware Cloud Foundation. So you saw in the other presentation details into of vSphere with Kubernetes and vSAN with persistent storage. There's also a session on how we do NSXT with the CNI and the edges. Now, VMware Cloud Foundation brings all these things together to build a really enterprise-grade Kubernetes infrastructure from ground up. That means all the way from hardware, IaaS tier, and then vSAN, NSX, and vSphere on top of it, and then Kubernetes. So we'll see in the next 15 minutes how we build that tier, what are the benefits that VMware Cloud Foundation brings to the table. And then we'll also see a small demo on this. So before we get into VCF, let's look at the top challenges our customers that are facing while deploying and maintaining enterprise-grade Kubernetes infrastructure. The top two are network and storage. So on the networking side, deploying edge components, configuring ingress and egress ports for the pods, integration of containers with the underlying SDN network. Those are the top three challenges. On the storage side, configuring persistence volumes, setting storage policies for the specific applications or deployment. On the security side, provide isolation to the pods and the namespaces remains a top challenge. Single sign-on, integrity and secure storage of container images. Customers download those images. They want a secure way to store them so that they can later kind of instantiate them in their deployment manifests. Another big problem is role-based access security. The other big thing that our customers mentioned to us is the operational consistency, right? So Kubernetes is moving very fast. Every 4 weeks or maybe faster than that, you get a new build of Kubernetes, upstream Kubernetes. And then you need to make sure that when you deploy that, the underlying infrastructure, your network, your storage, and the interfaces that they support for Kubernetes, they are also upgraded and they are also migrated, right? So the end-to-end lifecycle management of upstream Kubernetes and the underlying infrastructure remains a big challenge for our customers. And then we talked a little bit, both spoke about this a little bit. IT ops and developers have different tools, different processes, different models on which they interact with Kubernetes. So we need to make sure that these are maintained separately and they get to interact in the language that they are used to. Okay, and then finally, monitoring and scaling. Monitoring is again a big issue for our customers. Logging of pods and the underlying infrastructure. They want to make sure that they correlate both those things, and then scaling. Scaling at the Kubernetes level itself, and addition of clusters, shutting down of clusters, but then also once they are over capacity on that tier, they want to make sure they could easily add vSphere hosts into underlying infrastructure and then kind of augment that capacity. So these are the top challenges that our customers are facing. To build enterprise-grade Kubernetes infrastructure, it's probably much easier to do a small Kubernetes infrastructure on your desktop to develop applications. But what we're talking here are all these enterprise problems, right? So that's where the VMware Cloud Foundation 4 with Tanzu comes into picture. We bring in the app focus management, and then we also facilitate dev and IT operations collaboration. So let's start with the IT operator on the right hand side there, right? She continues to use the SDDC manager and the vCenter server to kind of do her things. For the first thing that she does is on a VMware Cloud Foundation, she creates a workload domain. The workload domain, as you know, is basically a small piece that's carved out within VMware Cloud Foundation data center, on which then you can bring in different kinds of workloads. So let's say here she has created a workload domain and she has added a couple of vSphere clusters, and she wants to then add Tanzu on top of those clusters. Okay, so basically what she does is she goes to SDDC Manager, runs a workflow, and then enables one or more of those clusters for Tanzu. That's when she's enabling it for Kubernetes. When that happens, as you've seen in the other presentation, we deploy respective components on those hosts in that cluster. We create a supervisor cluster tier on top of that. Once that is created, then she can create namespaces and allocate that to different projects, different applications, and then bring in the developers and DevOps on those namespaces. The best thing about this is that she's doing all these things from SDDC Manager and vCenter, right? She has not run a single kubectl command. She doesn't need to use any kind of cluster APIs. Once she does that, she can assign from her view, from her bottom-up view, she's looking at the namespace, and then that's her control plane. That's where she can assign policies for those applications, storage policies. She can assign persistent volumes to the namespaces. She can also bring in developers and DevOps on those namespaces. She can create users and permissions on those namespaces. So that's where her role kind of ends. And obviously, when she's on ongoing basis, when she's monitoring it, she can go to the vCenter or she can go to SDDC Manager to look at this from a different objects perspective and see how these objects are performing. Okay. On the other hand, the developers and DevOps, they continue to use the kubectl commands and the cluster APIs to create clusters, create clusters on demand, and then basically bring in their pods on top of that. Okay, just a refresher here. Now, VMware Cloud Foundation has become a basic building block to build all your data centers because it combines the vSphere, NSX, vSAN, vRealize out of the box. It is a building block from VMware to build your private data center, your edge, your service providers, your public cloud in a integrated HCI way. It is similar to what you were using ESX 10 to 15 years back to build your virtualized servers. You're using the same kind of construct in VMware Cloud Foundation now to build data centers.
So you guys haven't answered this question that we've had pre-presentation head on, and I think this is the perfect slide to do that. Okay. Can you guys tell us the difference between getting Tanzu with vSphere 7 and getting Kubernetes with vSphere 7 and needing VCF?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. To start with, in VCF 4.0 and vSphere 7, the only way to get Tanzu Tanzu with vSphere 7 on vSphere clusters is VMware Cloud Foundation. And the reason for that is basically, as I mentioned earlier, Kubernetes is just one layer of the stack. You need to have the entire infrastructure to be configured in the right way before you then enable that stack on top of the infrastructure. So in this first version, VCF will be the only way where you can get vSphere with Kubernetes.
So second part of that question is, if I have no desire, if I just don't want to use vSAN as my storage provider, do I have to deploy vSAN?
In this version, technically you don't have to do that. In the first version, we are kind of mandating the use of vSAN. But you can technically, in the future versions, you can have vSphere clusters with external storage without vSAN, and then bring in Kubernetes on top of that. And there are several options that we're looking at to do that as well. Okay, great questions. So what are the benefits? I think one of the big things that people are asking is why VMware Cloud Foundation with Kubernetes, right? So the first thing is VCF has a shareable dev-ready infrastructure, so you can deploy and manage your modern container apps alongside traditional apps or on VM. So you can have a workload domain carved out to just do container apps, or you can have just one workload domain and in which we have one cluster to do container apps, and then the next cluster in the same workload domain doing traditional VMs. Okay, so it's a dev-ready infrastructure where you can get any kind of apps. It's control at scale. As I said, one of the key value proposition of VMware Cloud Foundation is automated deployment and lifecycle management of Kubernetes. And it also does so that the underlying infrastructure, the compute storage and network is also upgraded so that there's no incompatibility between the Kubernetes and the underlying infrastructure. Adding and removing capacity, again, VMware Cloud Foundation makes it very, very easy. You can add host to augment the capacity, you can remove host from a workload domain to remove the capacity. And then we have a centralized console to do certificates, password, license management. So all those things that are required for Kubernetes will be now part of that centralized control. Okay. In terms of the velocity, I'll show you. We'll have a demo. The cloud admins don't need to have any kind of a learning curve to deploy Kubernetes. One of the big things that we heard from cloud admins is, hey, we don't want to get into the kubectl and cluster API and that kind of world. Allow us to operate the way we are operating. So basically, you continue to operate with SDDC Manager and vCenter. Okay, so you don't have to use that. And then accelerate production of Kubernetes deployment and modern apps. So right from the hardware to standing up the entire data center and getting Kubernetes on top of it, we can do it in less than a couple of hours. Okay, that's how fast we can do it. And that too, it's enterprise-grade Kubernetes, right? And this is all done by Cloud Admin. So here's a little bit of a deep, kind of a focused look at VMware Cloud Foundation workload domain. As I said, VMware Cloud Foundation workload domain is a space within the VCF data center, VCF instance that you create, so that then you can configure the infrastructure in such a way that you can bring in certain specific kind of workloads, right? So you can build a workload domain for, say, GPU-enabled VDI apps in which you allocate hosts which have GPU cards. That's one example. You can have a workload domain for just doing the test apps, staging apps, production apps. So different people are doing using workload domains for different purposes, but that's an abstraction with a sandbox abstraction. Behind the scene, it is a vCenter with a bunch of vSphere clusters behind it, which can be driven through policy in SDDC Manager. Okay, so you see at the bottom we have a workload domain vCenter, and then we have vSphere cluster, and then on top of that, using the workflow within SDDC Manager, you can pick, let's say there are 4 clusters, you can pick cluster number 1 and then enable Tanzu only on that cluster, on vSphere cluster. So only that cluster will then have the supervisor Kubernetes cluster components added to it. So there's one-to-one mapping between a supervisor cluster and a vSphere cluster. Okay, so once you do that, you can then basically the IT operator can create a namespace within the vCenter on the supervisor cluster, and then allocate it to the developers. The developers use cluster APIs to create K8 clusters, or they can use kubectl commands to bring their pods and other things on those K8 clusters. Okay.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
I think I may have heard you wrong, but did you just say there's a one-to-one mapping from a vSphere cluster perspective to a Kubernetes cluster as well?
No. There is one-to-one mapping between vSphere cluster to the supervisor Kubernetes cluster.
The supervisor.
Yes.
Okay, so the supervisor can manage multiple Kubernetes clusters.
Yes, and supervisor can manage multiple namespaces. And then within those namespaces, you can have multiple Kubernetes clusters.
Okay, cool. I figured I heard that wrong, but I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So let's look at the step-by-step on how the Cloud Admin does this. So on day 0, the Cloud Admin creates a workload domain, this space within VCF with an SXT. And when it creates the space, and automatically an SXT is configured, and vSAN is integrated, vRealize integrated. So you don't have to do anything extra because it's a HCI well integrated product. Once you does that, she can deploy and configure the NSXT edges and logical networking. Again, this is a automated workflow within SDDC Manager where with a few clicks you can configure NSXT edges. Now you can either deploy NSXT edges in the new workload domain, or if you already have NSXT edges in a different workload domain, those can be shared. So you don't have to every time create a NSXT edge when you want to enable a supervisor cluster on a vSphere. Okay, you can share those. And then you deploy Tanzu Kubernetes on top of the workload domain of vSphere clusters. You can do it cluster by cluster. You can do it for one clusters or many clusters or all clusters in the workload domain. Once you do that, on day end, when DevOps requests a space for running their applications, the Cloud Admin then creates the supervisor namespace and then adds that DevOps and devs to that namespace. And then she can set the storage policies on the supervisor namespace. How we create a supervisor policy, that's a vSAN. In the other presentation, you saw how you can create those policies. In this workflow, you can just assign those policies directly to the namespaces once created. right? And in the DevOps, what does the DevOps do? Then once he's assigned to that namespace, DevOps or developers, they can create Kubernetes clusters. They can configure Harbor for container images. They can create deployment manifests and deploy production container workloads. A small sample of that you have seen in other presentation by Bo. You can create a YAML file with deployment and specify your containers in that. And then finally, developers develop the apps, and then they test it on the Kubernetes clusters that are deployed on the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. Okay, so before I launch the demo, any questions? Okay. We saw a lot of slides, so let's see some demo, real-world demo here. So here in SDDC Manager, you can see that in the Solutions tab, we have introduced a new solution called Kubernetes for Workload Management. When you click on that, deploy, it brings you this wizard, and in the first thing in the wizard says, hey, you are supposed to do, before enabling Kubernetes or Tanzu on a vSphere cluster, make sure that you create a workload domain with a few clusters on top of it. And by the way, if you have not done it, you can do it directly from here. So there's a separate workflow in SDDC Manager that you can go through to create a workload domain. It also says that make sure that you have either deployed and configured the edge clusters so that the vSphere clusters in that workload domain can have access to those edges. If you have not done so, again, you can go and do it in an automated fashion through SDDC Manager. And then you need to get a bunch of IP addresses. Specifically, you need to get IP addresses for communication between the pods, the intra-pod service, and then between pods and the service. These are non-routable IP addresses. And then you should also define a couple of IP address sets for routable IP addresses for the ingress to the pods and egress. Right. So these are the things that you need once you select.
Before we go on, that second point interests me a lot. Licensing. Do the standard 60-day everything included try it before you buy it licenses apply?
Yeah, so basically what you'll have is you can use any VCF 4.0 licenses when you buy any VCF. When you get any VCF 4.0 licenses, it kind of explodes, and it's a soft bundle. VCF is a soft bundle. It explodes into vSphere licenses. You can use those vSphere licenses when you're creating a workload domain, and that goes for both trial as well as production. Yes.
Okay, so I can just go download the trial and say, give me something temporarily to set this up, make sure I know what I'm doing before I move to production.
That is right. Yes. Okay. So once you go through that, we are now created. We are now sure that you created a workload domain and you have kind of set up vSphere clusters with proper licensing. You have set up the edges. You can then point this wizard to that workload domain. Right, and automatically it pulls the clusters in that workload domain, the vSphere clusters in that workload domain. Now, mind you, at this point of time, those clusters don't have Tanzu on them. This workflow will help you to get Tanzu on top of it. Right. So here we have only one cluster, aptly named as K8S. Okay, so you can select that and go to the next. And it does a bunch of validation. As I said, it looks whether the NSXT edges are configured, whether vSAN is configured properly on those hosts, whether those hosts have proper capacity to then overlay Tanzu services on top of it. Once it does that, you can review it, and then it goes to that cluster. You can pick up that cluster. And it asks you what is your intent for this vSphere, for this supervisor cluster. Okay, are you going to give what is the sizing, rough sizing that you want to talk about? So it talks about sizing in terms of pods, CPU, storage, and memory. In this case, we are selecting small. And then you are asked to kind of pick up the network tier that you already configured in the workload domain. So we have settings for management network where you are supposed to specify the addresses for the management network. This is for the traffic between the management components in the supervisor cluster, as well as the traffic between the vCenter and those management components. Right. So these are the IP addresses for that, and then. Once you do that, You can then set up similar kind of networks for your network IP addresses for your workloads. This is the communication between the pods and the services like load balancers, and then the pods and the external world. These are the ingress kind of services as well, right? So you can select the edge cluster. This is where you'll need edge because you need to specify the routable IPs as well as the non-routable IPs. So these two, the pod seeder and the service seeder, these are the non-routable IP sets, and then the ingress and the egress needs routable IP sets. Okay, so once you do that, then you can select the storage policy. In other presentation by Gopala, you saw how to create those policies. Once they're created, you can just the cloud admin just have to apply that, for the management components for the disk and the cache. So
bigger question before I tweak this assumption. Are you guys redefining what SDDC is? So is SDDC now VCF, or is SDDC what VMware has traditionally called SDDC, which is virtualized data center with partnerships with storage, networking, and all these other ecosystem partners?
Yeah, so SDDC is the definition of SDDC remains the same. It's still the full stack deployment to get a software-defined data center that includes the partner ecosystem, partner components. Now, VCF is the fastest way to get SDDC in your enterprise. Okay, so VCF is a implementation use case of an SDDC, which basically integrates all those components in a hyper-converged way. We test it before we release this. Right. You can also have SDDC by going through VVDs, VMware validated designs, and deploy your own SDDC manually. VCF does it in an automated format, and that's how you can get the fastest way to a full-fledged enterprise-grade SDDC. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just makes some of the other slides confusing because I've been dealing with VMware for probably about 10 years now. So the concept of SDDC is probably about 7 or 8 years old. So when I see SDDC at the bottom of your current marketing deck, I think of that concept. And what it really is VCF, not SDDC. So yeah, VCF is a implementation tool to deploy SDDC in an automated fashion. Right. What I don't understand is the delineation from when I'm speaking of vSphere and I have a SDDC that's not built off of VCF. When I get some of these features and when I don't, like, do I get namespaces even without VCF? Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, in this version with vSphere 7.0 and VCF 4.0, the only way to get Tanzu services from vSphere, that includes the namespaces, supervisor namespaces, and the TKG services, is through VCF. That's in the first version, right? But you can still use your vSphere to do all the traditional things you have been doing. You can just buy vSphere and vSphere and vSAN and deploy it manually, and then basically use it the way you're traditionally using it. It's just that the licenses that are used to enable Tanzu and TKG and other services, they come only when you purchase vSphere with VCF, right? So I guess this is the other confusing thing, and you can help clarify that, the difference between Tanzu Kubernetes and Tanzu everything else. Because when I think of namespaces, as a computer scientist, I want namespaces, period. I don't care if I'm using namespaces to manage Kubernetes pods. I want them to manage VMs. So Tanzu is not just Kubernetes management, but it's Kubernetes management, VM management, and SDDC management, because those I can have other constructs other than VMs and containers. That is right. Yeah, So Tanzu is an umbrella term for the workload management plane that comes with vSphere 7.0, and that includes management of Kubernetes, management of VMs. By the way, that is still a tech preview feature. You don't get it in the commercial version, and other things that Bo talked about in his presentation. Right? Those are the services that comes under the brand umbrella of Tanzu.
Okay, we also have, that's a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid on-prem. There's also a Tanzu Mission Control, or TMC, that is a cloud-based service that we are developing, which can connect to your Kubernetes clusters, either which are deployed to Tanzu Kubernetes Grid and VCF, or any Kubernetes clusters out there in the public clouds, and then you can manage it from one control plane in SaaS. So Tanzu is our umbrella term, our brand to manage any workloads, right? That was introduced in vSphere 7.0. Okay, so that is Tanzu, and then within that there are different software components which enable you to manage, Kubernetes, VMs, and other workloads. Okay, so basically, once you've finished that, you can enable the workload management. You can see that here. It runs a bunch of automated processes where now they are getting all the supervisor components on those hosts in that vSphere cluster. You can go to the hosts and clusters in the vCenter. You can see that there is that K8s cluster, which has 3 vSphere hosts, and then you can look at each of those. This is workload management I was talking about. This is one single control management plane where you can see the namespaces, the clusters, and the updates. Right now, there's nothing here. You can go back to SDDC Manager. You started this workflow in the SDDC Manager. You can go back to SDDC Manager, and you'll see that now that cluster vSphere that you created in the workload domain is up and running for workload management. It means that you have enabled the supervisor cluster on that particular vSphere cluster. You can also see in the solutions tab that one workload management solution is deployed. That means one cluster is enabled for workload management. As I said earlier, workload domain can have multiple clusters, so you can pick and choose which one you want to enable for workload management or Tanzu services. Okay. Once you do that, you can now go and create your first namespace. The cloud admin, again, she's using the vCenter here. She can pick up the cluster that she wants to set the supervisor namespace on, and she can create up to I think 500 namespaces on a single supervisor cluster. And within those namespaces, then she can assign it to developers and the developers can bring in an application. Okay, so you can define this namespace here. Once you do that, you can see here, you can set the permissions on that namespace. It's running, the namespace is running now. This is a supervisor namespace that we're talking about. And then you can set permissions. You can bring in the admins, the DevOps, and the developers to that namespace, and they can start playing with it. You can assign storage policies to that namespace, and then monitor the capacity and the usage the way you were always doing it through CPU, memory, and storage usage. Right?
Ranjit, super quick question. Is all of this actionable through APIs, or do you have to go exclusively through the vSphere client?
So from the SDDC Manager, all these things, creation of workspace management and all those things is available through APIs. For some of the lower level controls about creation of namespaces, those are, I think, available through supervisor cluster API. Bo, can you confirm that those operations are available through API?
Yes, so I can confirm that all of the operation that you're doing here can be achieved both through via API.
Thank you.
Yes.
So with that's what I had for VCF and how it brings together all these different components to create end-to-end Kubernetes infrastructure with enterprise-grade features. Obviously, we do not have time to go through other features of VCF4. There are other features other than Kubernetes that we are bringing to VCF4, but that's a topic for other discussion. Thanks.